Thank you very much. It's great to be here tonight. Dan and I are here with the task of convincing you why diplomacy with Iran is going nowhere. And I think it's important as we begin thinking about this issue to stop for a moment and ask yourselves, what is our current diplomacy with Iran? What's the current state of affairs? The current state of affairs is that the Obama administration has privately and publicly offered direct, unconditional talks to the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime has failed to respond. So as of now, there is no diplomacy with Iran. There are no talks. Even if there were talks tonight, Dan and I want to describe for you why it is that those talks, in fact, are going nowhere. And it's for three reasons. There are really three elements that should be present in any set of diplomacy to have any chance for that diplomacy to succeed in preventing the Iranians from attaining a nuclear weapon. First, the current set of diplomacy of diplomatic outreach by the Obama administration includes no credible threat of military force should the diplomacy fail. Secondly, there's no timeline in place that would prevent the talks from dragging on and prevent the Iranians from using the talks as an excuse to continue to develop their nuclear program. And third, none of the very crippling economic sanctions that might actually convince the Iranians that the cost of attaining a weapon is too high are in place. Now, let me just be clear. Dan and I are not arguing that force is necessary. We're not arguing that military force is unavoidable. And we're not arguing that diplomacy itself is doomed to fail. We're simply arguing that the current course we're on is, in fact, a course to nowhere. Now, as you think tonight about your vote with respect to this resolution, one of the really important things to consider, which the Obama administration has not been considering, is the history of American efforts to reach out to the Iranians. And I wanted to just run through for you tonight a few of the high points of that history, because any realistic effort to use diplomacy effectively has got to take that history into account. In 1979, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski met in Algiers with the Iranian foreign minister, prime minister, and defense minister. And according to a note taker who was present in the meeting, Brzezinski told the Iranians, quote, "We will accept your revolution, we will recognize your country, we'll recognize your government, we'll sell you all the weapons that we contracted to sell the Shah." 3 days later, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized. 2 weeks later, the Iranian officials Brzezinski met with had lost their jobs. In 1980, Warren Christopher negotiated the Algiers Accords with the Iranian regime. The Iranians agreed to take no further hostile actions against the United States. 3 months later, they seized new American hostages in Lebanon. 1 year later, they attacked the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, and 3 years later, they killed 241 Marines in their barracks in Beirut. Throughout the 1990s, the Europeans threatened to impose sanctions if the Iranians didn't alter their behavior. The Iranians did not alter their behavior, and the Europeans did not impose sanctions. In 1996, Iran was responsible for bombing Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, killing 19 American soldiers. Despite this attack in the late 1990s, Washington decided it was time to try again, to extend yet another hand to the Iranians to build a new relationship. We lifted parts of our sanctions program, allowing food and humanitarian supplies into Iran. And the President and the Secretary of State gave speeches essentially apologizing to the Iranians for past American behavior. In response, the Iranian Supreme Leader said these apologies were, quote, "too little, too late," and did no one any good since Americans continue to commit such crimes. Now, you can read a much fuller account of this part of the diplomatic history in Ken Pollack's terrific book, which I really do commend to you, called The Persian Puzzle. You're welcome. But to be fair, though, it's not just Ken who's been involved in failed attempts to reach out to the Iranians. Nick and I have also had our fair share of that as well, when we both worked in the Bush State Department. 2004, the European Union 3 completed the Paris Agreement with the Iranians, in which they promised to suspend enrichment activities. In August of 2005, Ahmadinejad was elected. They announced they were continuing their enrichment activities, and the Russians prevented us from attaining any real sanctions against the Iranians at the United Nations. In 2006, we took the step of offering for the first time in 30 years direct negotiations if the Iranians would give up their enrichment program, and our European allies committed to imposing tough sanctions if they didn't. The Iranians didn't give up the enrichment program, and of course our allies wouldn't allow us to impose tough sanctions. In 2007, the National Intelligence Estimate, parts of which were declassified, showed there is one thing, actually, that the Iranians did respond to. Although the Iranians continued to enrich uranium, they did halt other parts of their nuclear weapons program in the immediate aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In 2008, despite the fact that the Iranians had failed to meet any condition we had set for direct talks, and despite the fact that they were funneling weapons and terrorists into Iraq to kill Americans, we sent our Undersecretary of State, Bill Burns, to meet with the Europeans and Iranian representatives. Once again, the Iranians learned that no red line is really a red line. To sum up this history, let me quote from the man who was actually the note taker at that first meeting in Algiers in 1979. He's our current Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates. Describing this meeting recently, Secretary Gates said, quote, "Every administration since then has reached out to the Iranians in one way or another, and all have failed. Some have gotten into deep trouble associated with their failures, but the reality is the Iranian leadership has been consistently unyielding over a very long period of time in response to repeated overtures from the United States." In closing, let me just say that the history of our attempts to reach out to Iran offer us lessons about the three things that might actually work in terms of inducing Iranian effort, in terms of stopping Iranian efforts to attain a nuclear weapon. We've got to have a credible threat of the use of force if diplomacy fails. There have to be crippling economic sanctions that impose a significant cost on Iranian attempts to attain a weapon. And we've got to have a timeline so that the diplomacy doesn't drag on forever. None of those things characterize our current diplomacy with the Iranians. And therefore, diplomacy with Iran is going nowhere. Thank you.